Hello, thank you for joining this session. My name is Michael Igoe. I'm a senior reporter with Devex. We're talking about the other side of crisis, building movements for transformational change. I'm joining you today from Burlington, Vermont, where the days are getting short and there's snow on the ground. I hope everyone is staying healthy and safe through this difficult time. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited about this conversation. It's something of an experiment in bold thinking, transdisciplinary thinking. And we're bringing together people to sort of challenge the calls that we've heard about building back better coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, and to put some thought and substance behind what that will really mean and what it will require. As a reporter, the people who are joining us today are some of the people that I turn to regularly to really help me understand how power works in global development, how change happens in global development. And I'm really excited to share our conversation with you today. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll jump right in because things are moving quickly today. We have Paul O'Brien, who's a vice president from Oxfam America. We have Nazanin Ash, who's joining us also as vice president at the International Rescue Committee. And we have Loyce, who's the president and executive director of the Global Health Council, and also a recent appointee to President-elect Joe Biden's COVID-19 task force. So wonderful to see all of your faces. I'm so glad we can do this. Thanks so much for being here. So I'm going to jump in with questions. And I want to start with Paul, because you've recently written a book on this topic, so I know you're well prepared. But let's talk about transformation and what transformation looks like at this really difficult and challenging moment. Can the same approach to development that existed prior to the pandemic bring the world out of it? And if not, what would a transformative agenda for global development look like? And how is that different from what we have now, Paul?
Thanks, Michael. Good to be with you and with this great group. Short answer, no. The old ways won't work. If we think what our job is now is to restore the way we were before the pandemic hit, we will end up with a lot of problems. I loved your setup because you said, are we going to have an honest conversation about power and development? I think for a very long time we haven't been. We haven't understood how power works in our own sector. We talk about empowerment of communities, but we are always often deeply reluctant to talk about who we're going to take power from. And if we aren't able to do that, we're going to end up in a world that remains as unequal and unfair as it was before this pandemic, and will continue to have people having completely divided realities. This pandemic may have united us in fear around the world, but it is dividing us in outcome. We have the vast majority of people living in low-income countries are not going to get a vaccine, while the rich countries are going to be awash in vaccines. People in poverty or refugees and migrants are going to be facing the economic consequences of lockdown and lack of resources for development. So unless we have an honest conversation about power and the kind of power switch that we're going to need in the world, which will largely be driven by activists who are going to make politicians do it, we're not going to see the kind of transformation that you're asking about. But it's all on the table right now because change happens during moments of disruption.
Thank you, Paul. That was a perfect intro. I also love that you got the title of your book in there, which is just over your right shoulder. Congratulations.
Thanks, Michael.
So I mentioned at the outset that this is a transdisciplinary conversation, and that's because we're bringing together people who sort of work on different aspects of the global development and humanitarian puzzle. Nazanin International Rescue Committee obviously is a large international humanitarian organization. You're deeply and actively engaged in issues of displacement and refugee protections. When it comes to issues of conflict and displacement and humanitarian assistance, the system was not really working before COVID. So And the pandemic, we should say, does not seem to be a force for peace. I mean, we're seeing new conflicts break out around the world as we speak. So when you hear the words build back better, what does that imply for the sphere of issues and challenges that you confront around conflict and displacement? What's a build back better agenda for your challenging range of issues?
Thanks so much, Michael, and it's so great to be with these amazing panelists. And Paul really set up this question well, and so did you. I mean, we weren't operating in an environment where our collective action systems and our humanitarian response systems were working well even prior to COVID. We've seen a tripling of humanitarian need just over the last 5 years to a record 235 million people. And that's been tremendously exacerbated by COVID, a 40% increase in need just over the last year. But it is, as you noted, Michael, really conflict that's driving the vast majority of humanitarian need. And what we've seen is a real breakdown in the systems of conflict resolution, a real breakdown in fidelity to the laws of war, all of which is exacerbating the consequences of conflict and prolonging conflict itself. So what I'd say is, even before the moment we're in, humanitarian response plans were on average only less than 50% funded. Last year, coincident with tremendously rising need, was the first time in a decade that we saw a reduction in humanitarian aid. And conflicts like Syria and Yemen have really dropped the floor out from under our international norms related to civilian protection and even humanitarian access. So what we needed to see even before this moment was a real reinvigoration of commitment to those collective rules around protecting civilians in conflict, around ensuring humanitarian access to those most vulnerable, as Paul highlighted, and reinvigorated commitment to resolving conflicts, which are at the root of ever-growing humanitarian need.
And we'll talk about this more as we move into the discussion. There are blueprints out there on these range of issues. One of them, Nazanin, is the grand bargain. Is it as simple as just putting action behind the words that are contained there? Or are you speaking to deeper seated issues that even something like that doesn't quite confront?
I think the elements of the grand bargain are an excellent roadmap and framework for modernizing the way we deliver humanitarian aid. So, in a context in which conflicts are protracted and humanitarian crises are protracted, the average length of displacement now is 10 years. The average length of conflict now is 30 years. So recognizing these trends, our model of humanitarian response needs to move from, Band-Aid care and feeding approaches to approaches that allow people to rebuild their lives in, new communities and countries of first refuge, in host communities. And they need to move, and that means moving financing to longer term time frames and moving financing closer to the ground, to frontline responders, national and local actors who know how to expand reach and scale in their local context and know how to implement development approaches in their local context, with the international community playing a much stronger role in securing rights and access for vulnerable populations so that they can have legal rights to work, access to education, and all those tools that would allow them to rebuild in their new communities. What it doesn't get to, though, what the grand bargain doesn't get to, is that reinvigoration of collective global rules of order. So what I'm talking about there was very much thrown into relief by the international response to COVID, which is a classic collective action need. And what you really needed to see out of, for example, the multilateral system was a coordinated way of ensuring that supplies and materials were distributed on the basis of greatest need. You needed to have a coordinated commitment to securing humanitarian access, such that humanitarians and responders could reach populations in need at a time where we were seeing a very diverse and globalized lockdown at almost every local level in which, for example, the IRC works. And you needed the multilateral system to drive inclusion for vulnerable populations, refugees, women and girls, displaced populations who are often left out by accident or by design, from social safety nets and COVID response plans. Those are collective action problems that need collective action solutions out of our multilateral system.
Thank you. I think our experiment here is working because you've just transitioned us into a conversation about health. For those who did not know Loyce Pace before, they've maybe come to know you now, or at least recognize your face from BBC or your voice from National Public Radio. I've enjoyed hearing your voice come on the radio. You're now a member of Biden's transition team, the COVID-19 response task force. But you've been building coalitions for global health for a really long time. You've been thinking about sort of these opportunities for transformation for a really long time. Do you see an opportunity in this crisis to reimagine how global health gets prioritized, organized, funded, and to speak to some of those sort of collective action problems that Nazanin just described?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks again for having us all here today, Michael. And it's great to be here with not just friends, but bold thinkers in this space. As you said, it's something I feel very passionate about, how we do differently. And even before COVID, I think a number of us really saw this conversation and the subsequent actions long overdue. With regards to what we do now, I think it's really heartening to see and hear a number of people being on board with being bold. I think we can go a couple different ways in the wake of crisis. And even though there's an adage around crisis yielding opportunity, I do think there could be a tendency for even advocates to retract and sort of be more pragmatic and feel as though, look, it's just going to be that much harder to get things done and have this scarcity mindset. And so I'm really proud of a number of us who are able and willing to be brave in this moment and really just to say, look, enough is enough. Either we do it differently or we all fail. I think that's where my head is, frankly, with all this. So I am fully supportive of how we break the box in global health. And I will admit that I think in the global health space, we've done some things to perpetuate perhaps business as usual, right? Health has taken up a lot of space in development. I think there's been a lot of good, obviously, that's come out of our work. But we are having our own reckoning with regards to how we sort of help or hurt the greater cause in the way that we continue to do business. For example, there's a lot more, I would argue, that health could do to sync up with our siblings across the development spectrum and support their work in a way that lifts all boats. There's no reason, for example, that in the wake of COVID, we don't think more critically about the connection between health and climate, or health and migration and conflict, or health and gender equity. All of these issues and disparities are coming to the surface, particularly during this health crisis, and it presents an opportunity for us to connect those dots in even more meaningful ways. So we have it in the SDG framework, right? Like we know all of this is true, and yet our actions, our resources, how we actually walk the talk is something we have yet to demonstrate. And I just really encourage all of us to do that moving forward.
Thanks, Loyce. And understanding that you're not here speaking on behalf of the Biden transition, but also knowing that your Twitter handle is Global Game Changer.
Super humble.
Do you expect the Biden administration will go big on international COVID response and also take up some of these really big agenda items that you described? Or is there going to be such a requirement of so much energy to simply build back to a place of stability that those things are going to have to wait or sort of require energy from other other aspects of the global health community?
Well, I hope so. I believe that there is an openness to big, bold ideas, and I think we have heard that from the president-elect with regards to some of the priorities they've set already and some of the markers they've put down. So I think that I have heard that as an invitation to all of us to walk in with those big, bold ideas. Sure, there will be very basic things that need to be done, and as you suggested, repaired, restored. If the U.S. comes back to all this and just says, pretends as though the past year or four, for that matter, never happened, then we have failed ourselves, let alone everyone else. So I would imagine and encourage that's not a posture that we take. And in fact, welcome people really coming to the table and saying, okay, well, how can we flip the script in development and global health in a way that Nazanin and Paul have mentioned, right? Like, how do we shift the power to our partners on the ground? If you just take global health security and this idea of global health security, I'll say, as we're still using that term, the way that's been designed to date has, largely been built on these historical, multilateral structures, and yet we have seen those major actors really flounder, if not fail, in the wake of COVID. And so what happens if we redesign or rebuild even that architecture so that power is even more sort of held and felt by partners in Asia and Africa, for example, who really have been knocking it out of the park, especially considering the resource constraints that are felt in those regions. So even just that, I think, is something that any leader, I would hope, would be open to exploring. And while there have been pilots or some examples of that in years before 2020, in the months before 2020, I would love to see how not just the U.S. but other sort of traditional leaders and donors around the world step into a different reality.
Fantastic. I want to encourage you all to just jump in. We're all unmuted here. But I do want to turn to Paul. I mean, you've been thinking about this for a long time. Where do you see the most effective levers of change? I mean, Loyce is, working hard to influence the presidential transition process, but what do you think it's going to take? Is this a grassroots challenge? Is it donor agencies? Is it the private sector? Some combination of everything? Where does change actually happen, Paul?
Yeah. As I was listening to Loyce, I was thinking, like, how often does this happen that we get this opportunity where you've got the folks who are coming into office saying, we want to be bold, but at some level, you're gonna have to make us do it. The invitation is there. But we need to know that you care and that you're willing to put your own political voices behind this, because getting stuff done that is transformative is always hard. And there's every reason. I mean, we've been having the privilege of sitting in on a few transition team meetings, and they have every excuse to say, you know what, it's been such a mess that just give us a chance to normalize things and just focus on restoration for a while. And leave it at that. And so if you're sitting there and you realize that 9 out of 10 people in low-income countries aren't going to get a vaccine, and 500 million people have just lost their jobs, that's not going to work. So the way I hear your question, Michael, is how do we get a positive signal that is politically relevant to folks like Loyce and others who are actually listening for where political energy is, that gives them more momentum, not just to be restorative, but to be transformative. And I think we are going to need new answers. And that's why I love the title of this panel you got us all on, which is, about movement building. You earlier on had Renew from Nigeria. I was on a call with Oxfam campaigners from around the world this morning, and coincidentally, quite a few from Nigeria and from Latin America that Loyce just mentioned. There is a form of activism and movement building that's going on out there in communities and slums, in refugee communities, Nazanin, in in rural communities that have access to internet and sometimes in-person organizing that is profoundly different to anything that I certainly grew up with as a young activist. It's faster, it's more nimble, it's less hierarchical, it's more organic, and it is willing to collect and organize power that can work across borders. And I do believe that we are going to go into a couple of years of heightened, particularly youth-led organic activism. You watched how Black Lives Matter moved. You watched how racial justice work in the United States more generally has taken off around the world. What's happening with gender justice movements. There's so many other examples. We have got to find a way as organized activists who want to convince the Biden and Harris administration and other centers of traditional power that there is political energy out there that will support them if they are transformative. And then we've got to find a way to be relevant to those growing movements to say, maybe you could spend some of your time demonstrating your power in these spaces. Because I do think collectively, we haven't seen a moment like this where the possibility for movement building to convince politicians that it's worth spending political capital on transformative ideas. I haven't seen it be like this, and certainly in my time of 20 years of activism, partly because of the crisis that we're in.
I think that's right. If I really can dive in per your invitation, Michael, it's surprising to me how few in our community I feel were really ready for this moment. And I think, in fairness, it's been a hard haul, 2020 aside, let alone the months and years before now, this moment we're in. It's been hard. And I think the times that, Global Health Council, for example, has brought people together and asked or begged them to dream big, people have welcomed it because they've said, goodness, I spend so much time just fighting, and defending and not dreaming and not considering, well, what if somebody walked up to me and said, here's double your money, what are you going to do with it? What change are you going to make? So I agree with Paul completely. Now is the time to come with it. And I think there are other movements who have shown up in this way. Climate community comes to mind, obviously the movement for Black Lives. But I would hate for, I will speak at least for the health community, those of us in this space to squander it. And I'm really, again, glad that folks are really ready to rally. I will also add, in addition to youth-led movements that Paul referenced, I think connecting it to the previous conversation that you all hosted, this is going to be BIPOC-led, and appropriately so, right? Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities around the world have been doing this forever, let's be clear. And yet now is the time that I think their mics are turned up even more, their platform is even more elevated, they're able to work in these innovative ways so that, the field is flattened and they can break through, right? And that's as it should be, as they should. And I'm really excited about that energy, about those different faces and voices coming to the table with the new ask for people, like some of us who have been doing this for so long and probably need that shot in the arm to reinvigorate the cause and even get out of the way to allow those people to lead.
And I would add to that in addition to the power of grassroots and activist-led movements, the incentives are there for governments to come together and take a different approach. I mean, if you take just a simple analysis, you look at what I described of exponentially increasing needs and at the same time reduced financing. You look at how the humanitarian assistance budget is taking over an ever greater proportion of U.S. foreign aid, when we need to be dedicating resources to climate causes and mitigation, to longer-term development approaches, and it just and again, COVID threw into stark relief that the model of responding to humanitarian need with aid is not going to work. You need to address those root causes of conflict and climate and governance as well. And the imperatives are there. The moral obligation is clear with the tremendous and growing vulnerability, but so are the strategic imperatives. Unaddressed humanitarian need, unaddressed and proliferating conflict introduces tremendous stability and security concerns. And that's what we're seeing all over the world. You take the top 20 countries where you have a growing humanitarian need, and they account for just 10% of the global population, but they account for 85% of humanitarian need. They account for almost 90% of displaced populations and 85% of refugees. So what that tells you, if you take a really different approach to those fragile contexts, those contexts that are, Loyce, as you were speaking to earlier, actually below the level of where we've been talking about with global health security. There are places where you have belligerent or unresponsive government who are neglecting the needs of their people. We need to take a different approach to resolving conflicts at that level in order to be able to create the space for the kinds of global solutions and problem solving and collective development that we want to see.
Thank you, Nazanin. Yeah, Paul, please jump in. I'll just sit back here. I think you've got it under control.
No, be careful. But just to build a little off what Loyce and Nazanin just said, in the end of the day, we do have to get specific about, okay, great, we want transformative visions, but we need to have these resources. And certain things, I would argue power of a certain type, but also resources are finite, and therefore it has to get redistributed. And you have to be able to name where it's going to come from. I totally agree with Nazanin. You're not going to get it out of traditional conversations about foreign aid. We're going to have a conversation about where the big money is. Are we spending the right amount on hard power? And can we better balance the tools of our foreign policy so that when we are strengthening public health systems, we're not overextended with our military? Are we willing to have a different conversation about debt? We've got 48 countries that are spending 4 times the amount on debt repayments as they are on public health. How the hell are they going to respond to a pandemic when all their money is going straight out the door? We are having a conversation globally about whether we can unlock global reserves. It's being blocked by one country, the United States, at the moment. If we could get the United States to unlock its resistance to special drawing rights, which are authorized through the IMF, you could literally get hundreds of billions of dollars without congressional approval moving back into health systems and into economies. And taxes. And there is no stronger lobbying force against taxes in the world than the collective power of American corporations. And frankly, it's the pharma sector that spends more on lobbying to keep their taxes low, and the ones that are giving us now the new vaccines. But at the same time, we want to have them pay more of those profits in the form of resources that can then go to health and education and social protection. So we're going to have a different conversation about how to spend the money that we actually have in a finite world, and that's ultimately going to be about redistributing power.
Okay. Let's talk about redistributing power, because there are a few areas where the pandemic has been sort of a forcing event for the ways that development organizations function and the way that power is distributed. And one of those that we've seen and that we've reported on a lot is just out of sheer necessity, a sort of accelerated shift towards localization, because you can't travel anymore. And so the people who are in the place where the problem exists have to be empowered to deal with it. Is that, and this is for all of you and on the range of issues that you all work on, do you see that as a transition that is likely to continue into the future? That we're now on the path towards localization that's been catalyzed by this pandemic, or is that something that's going to revert back because of vested interests and sort of a reaction that brings us back to business as usual? And I'm happy for anyone to jump in on that.
I think we can't come back to business as usual there, because just as you said, Michael, COVID really identified the massive benefit of localized responses, because it wasn't it wasn't just that people couldn't travel. It's that in every local context, you needed very specific and bespoke solutions, based on, the rules and regs around movements and then the restrictions that were put in place, like I said, at every local community level, based on the resources available, based on the culture and climate of those communities. And so it really was sort of local actors that could do the most rapid problem solving to be able to be responsive. But what we found is that we were tremendously constrained, not only by the fact that financing was very slow and in general, a small proportion of it reaches directly to those frontline and local actors. So financing and the speed of it was a tremendous constraint, but also the lack of flexibility. So the lack of sort of trust that we defer to frontline actors, and moving to a system where we have accountability for results, accountability for financial transparency, but where we provide the flexibility and financing for local actors to be able to be immediately responsive. I often describe, in our COVID context, we were experiencing changes on almost a bi-weekly basis to the rules and regs around movement and other COVID responsive mitigation measures. So we needed the flexibility to be able to pivot in precisely that way. We also saw that while at the outset there was a tremendous amount of focus on COVID specific mitigation measures, very quickly those secondary impacts of economic devastation, other health impacts, education impacts, came to the fore, and we needed to be able to pivot to those. So having the flexibility of financing was also really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree completely. That rubber band can't snap back, right? If it does, shame on us. And I think the good news is I also sit on the board of Interaction, and I think a number of us are involved in those sorts of collaboratives where I'm hearing organizations and leaders of organizations unpack this problem and have real candid conversations with themselves and their teams about the assumptions I think they might have had. To Nazanin's point, you could really transfer not just power, but trust and authority to local actors in different ways, right? And I think people are learning that real time out of necessity. And so, it's too bad it's taken a COVID for our community to arrive at this point. But I think it's really great, especially for local actors, right? Who are like, yeah, we've been telling you that this is something that we've needed and that you could do for years. And so I don't see any reason why it can't be sustained. And I think we're going to be really hard pressed to try and turn back the clock, come 2021 or 22 and beyond, given what's been tested and proven this year. I'll say even beyond the NGO sector too, I want to see the U.S. government learn from this as well, right? And really with regards not just to localization, but that idea of flexible funding. We have operated in silos for years with reason, right? And yet, I think we all know that systemic solutions, integrated approaches, don't necessarily mean we're not going to have results. We're not going to be able to realize and measure change. And so that's another assumption I think that's being critically questioned. And I think we should continue to challenge that moving forward, because I think that's the only way we're truly going to get across the finish line and all of the priorities we care about in this space.
And
okay,
at the same
I have
time,
one provocative idea that I want to throw out, because I've got a member of the transition team in this panel discussion. Could it be possible that the U.S. government would actually give money to local institutions and say, all these international NGOs want to be the partner of choice? Well, we're going to let you choose them. The efforts to decolonize our sector and the subtle forms of power that we exercise are only really going to pick up speed when you change the power dynamics over the control of resources. So let's see how we behave when we're actually now the subject of choice rather than the makers of choices.
That's right.
All right, so 30 seconds. Nazanin, 30 seconds for you. Final thoughts. We're just about out of time.
Well, what I wanted to add was I don't want to let governments off the hook in terms of what they really need to secure in the global environment. So we talked about changes in financing models, but where we need governments to show up and to show up in multilateral fora like the UN is in enforcing those global rules, enforcing and leveraging their humanitarian diplomacy and their relationships globally to secure humanitarian access when governments and non-government actors are putting impediments in place that impede humanitarians from being able to reach vulnerable populations. Leaning on those global rules to ensure that all vulnerable populations are included, including refugees and women and girls. Leaning on those global rules to enforce rules around civilian protection and the protection of civilian infrastructure. So reinvigorating fidelity, to those reinvigorating fidelity to those laws of war and attention to vulnerable populations and inclusion are where we need governments to, and especially the U.S. government. There's been such a vacuum of global leadership on these fronts over these last 4 years. That's the reinvigoration of the multilateral system we need.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you all so much. This has been fantastic. We'll keep the conversation going.
Thanks, y'all.